So here's a basic situation. You sit down, you're under the gun, you open raise, the button decides to 3-bet you, folds around to you. What do you do? And more importantly, what do you 4-bet with in this situation? If you have no idea or your first thought is, I guess, kings plus, make sure to watch this entire video. This is going to be extremely important. Let's see what the GTO solver suggests you should be 4-betting with preflop in a live cash game. Let's get into it. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today I want to run through some 4-betting ranges with you from the new live GTO solve from the GTO Poker Ranges app. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Alright, so if you've already unlocked the app, you can follow along by opening it up, going to full ring, and going to live RGTO, and just going from there. I'm personally going to use the visualizer. This is our backend admin tool that we use for previewing all the ranges, and the builder is pretty much the exact same as it is in the app. The ranges are the exact same. It just visually looks a little bit different, but it should suffice for this video. So let's start by taking a basic situation. Let's say we are under the gun, we open raise, folds around to the button who 3-bets, folds around back to us, and we're deciding what we want to do, and let's see what the solver would suggest 4-betting in this situation. So we have under the gun opens, we have the button 3-bets, and we have under the gun, and here we are. And you notice right off the bat, this is a pretty darn tight range. Now, whenever we're talking about solver outputs, I think it's really important to understand what the inputs were, what the original game tree and parameters were to fully understand what the output looks like, or at least understand it a little bit better. So when it comes to the live GTO solve that we did, we worked with a 4x open raise sizing. Preflop 3-bets were 3x in position and 4x out of position. 4-bets were 2.75x in position and 3x out of position. So that way you can kind of keep in mind the way that these ranges and more importantly the sizes are impacting these ranges at the end of the day. And while these overall sizes might not be perfect, they are very, very representative of most live cash games, and as such should definitely get us in the ballpark when understanding the solver output and looking at these specific preflop ranges. Alright, so with all that context out of the way, one of the first things I like to look at when I'm looking at preflop ranges, especially solver output, is what is the overall frequency looking like. And in this situation, you notice that the solver is suggesting a 4-bet 18.1% of the time, a call roughly 31% of the time, and a fold the other 51% of the time. And this is really interesting because a lot of players almost certainly are going to fold much higher than 51% of the time. A lot of players are going to be somewhere closer to 70 or 75% fold versus 3-bet in this situation when they open under the gun, the button 3-bets, and there's no other players involved. Not shocking that the solver is suggesting a lower frequency than normal, especially in 3-bet, 4-bet, and 5-bet pots, because a lot of players just simply overfold in those situations. But you notice the solver is not going to be doing that. Now the next thing I like to look at is what is the kind of value stuff that seems to be getting 4-bet and what is the quote bluffier stuff. And I put bluffy in quotes because it's not like pure bluffs. It's not like the solver is going to suggest you 4-bet here with 7-deuce offsuit. Well, if nothing else, because you didn't open raise that from under the gun, hopefully. But you notice it's not like the purest of absolute nonsense. There's no deuce 3, there's no queen 6 offsuit, there's no like pure crap like that. Instead, it's typically going to be these like blockery hands with like ace X with a suited or king X with a suited. Not shocking to see some combinations like that in there. But of course you notice that the bulk of the overall quote value stuff is right up here in this top left hand corner. We have pure aces, which means 100% 3-bet, 100% 4-bet in this exact situation. But you notice the other hands like ace king suited, even pocket kings are going to be mixes. So the kings is going to be a 4-bet 64% of the time, and then if we click call, then we can see the other. So 36% of the time it's going to be a call, 64% it's going to be a 4-bet. A lot of players will, of course, just default 4-bet this every single time and not really think too much of it, or they're either going to pure call it and try to slow play it that way. So this is at least a little bit different than what most players are going to be doing. Most players are not mixing and don't really even fully understand mixing. And if you don't, I have a full video about that. I'll leave a link for that in the description box if you are curious. So some of the big takeaways when we're looking at this situation is you notice that the solver is protecting its call versus 3-bet range out of position here, making sure that it has some things like pocket kings, even pocket queens, ace queen suited, even some ace king both suited and offsuit in its call versus 3-bet range. range. You notice that there is 4-betting with some airier hands. You notice that we have some king jack suited, some king 10 suited, and same thing with some of the ace 5 through ace 3 suited. Some of that is in there, and that just makes a decent amount of sense, and is also probably one of the reasons why the solver has some of that in under the gun's open raising range in the first place. Naturally, make sure that it can give action correctly when it does in fact face a 3-bet and it's out of position. And you notice that, of course, it's a decent amount of strong stuff, but it's not 100% of it because of that range protection we just talked about. So again, this is kind of interesting stuff. Now, how do you use this in real time when you're not playing against a perfect GTO 3-better on the button, when you're not playing against someone who's going to play totally perfect against your 4-bets in general? Well, that's kind of a conversation for another day, since it can get into a lot of different minutia, a lot of different variables come into play there, but this is the way that the solver is making the preflop suggestions in a perfect GTO environment. Alright, so now let's look at a slightly different situation. We're still going to be out of position facing a 3-bet from the button, but this time instead of being under the gun ourselves, we're going to open raise from the hijack, then face a button 3-bet, and then have to make that decision again with no other players involved. So now let's see what the spot looks like. Alright, so updating the situation here, we open from the hijack, the button 3-bets, and the hijack player, us, is going to look at 4-betting. And again, one of the first things we notice if we look over at the frequencies is that folding suggestion 53.1% from the GTO solver, which again is a lot lower than most people are. Most players simply fold far too often against 3-bets, which is one of the reasons why you can typically get away with a little bit of extra 3-betting in a lot of live cash games, so keep that in mind. But overall, notice that the continuance suggestion tends to be much higher from the GTO solver than it is in real life. And then if we start poking around through the actual range suggestion, you notice still a lot of hands up in that upper left-hand corner. This time we do have pure kings in the 4-bet range, and of course aces is still going to be there as well. Ace-king suited is now a pure 4-bet. Ace-king offsuit is getting 4-bet more often than it was before. And now you see an inclusion of some queens, some jacks, a sliver of pocket 10s at 0.5% of it, and then also a little bit more on king-jack suited, a little bit more on king 10 suited, and even ace-queen offsuit is in there to an extent as well. You're also seeing a little bit more in terms of the ace 5, ace 4, ace 3 suited, and also now a new inclusion with king 6 suited at 5.18% of the time getting 4-bet. So if at first glance you're looking at this and you're like, wait, the 4-bet percentage overall is actually very similar to what it was in the previous one, right? Roughly 18%-ish, and now all of a sudden 19-ish%. So why the heck are the ranges so different? Well, the hijack is open raising more hands, and as such, even though it is a roughly similar percentage of the overall 4-bet frequency, there are more hands to be selected from, and as such, that's why you're seeing more hands included in this overall hijack 4-bet range. And for giggles, let's also poke around through the call versus 3-bet suggestion, and you notice, not shockingly, that the strong pocket pairs that are not getting 4-bet very often are getting called the rest of the time. So whatever is not getting 4-bet of pocket queens is then getting called. Same thing with jacks, same thing with pretty much all of pocket 10s, 99.5%. And you actually notice that ace queen is a mix not just between 4-betting and calling the 3-bet, but also between folding against the 3-bet. A lot of players probably are a little bit shocked by that one, but not too shocking at all. Ace queen suited, ace jack suited, all of these are going to be call versus 3-bets, and not shocking with the overall hands that are being included in the call versus 3-bet range, right? Most of the stuff in the upper left hand corner that's not going to end up getting 4-bet is pretty much included here. That's a very typical way of the solver constructing these ranges, so nothing too shocking in terms of the overall construction here. But overall, the big takeaways when we're looking at this range, not shockingly, is a decent chunk of continuance. You notice that there is more call versus 3-bet than raw 4-betting going on in this situation, and the overall 4-betting range itself is not too shocking. Most stuff in that upper left hand corner, but we do not have pure queens or pure jacks as 4-bets here. Even ace king offsuit is not a pure 4-bet in this situation. It is 4-bet a good chunk of the time at 74%, but it is not a pure 4-bet by any stretch of the imagination. And then of the quote airy hands or the bluffier stuff, not shocking. Again, it's using that strongish king jack suited that's not strong enough to call, right? Because king queen suited is a call in this situation, whereas king jack suited is a partial call, partial 4-bet. Same thing with king 10 suited, and then also some of that ace x suited as well, and king 6 suited getting 4-bet a small chunk of the time as well. So again, I find these results fascinating. Hopefully this kind of helps you see how the solver is thinking about this, and if nothing else, exactly what the solver is suggesting those 4-bet ranges look like in this perfect GTO environment. All right, so we've looked at a couple of out of position situations. Now let's switch it up and look at a spot where we are in position. So in this one, we're going to open raise from the cutoff. The big blind is going to 3-bet us, and we're going to make our decision from there and see what this solver suggests. So let's check this one out. All right, so updating the builder, we have us opening from the cutoff, the big blind 3-bets, and let's look at a spot where we 4-bet from the cutoff overall. And this one might be a little bit shocking at first glance. So one thing I'm noticing right off the bat is notice that pocket aces is not a pure 4-bet in this situation. It's getting 4-bet some chunk of the time, but it's actually getting called a very good chunk of the time, which might be a little shocking at first glance. Of course, pocket kings is pretty much always a 4-bet in this situation at roughly 96% of hands, and then the other 4% of pocket kings is just going to get called in this situation. And if we flick over and look at the call versus 4-bet, you notice that there are almost 3.5 times as many hands getting shoved into the call versus 3-bet range as opposed to the 4-bet range. And position, closing action, all of those things are going to factor in when it comes to why this range looks so different than the previous 4-betting ranges we've looked at so far. And one of the other things that's massively lowering the overall 4-bet frequency here, if we get the calls off for a moment, is you notice that we don't have that inclusion of things like king 6 suited or ace 5, ace 4, ace 3 suited. All of a sudden those hands aren't really in here, and even the king jack suited, king 10 suited hands that were getting 4-bet a decent chunk in previous examples are now actually just getting shoved into the calling range, again utilizing their position edge. So you notice that there's a little bit of 4-betting with things like ace jack off and king jack off, little bit of ace 10 suited, little bit of ace 8 suited at 0.5% of the time, but ultimately there's not as much of that kind of bluffier 4-betting going on according to the GTO solver, and I am putting bluffier 4-bet in air quotes in this situation. And by the way, if you find this overall range and especially the range construction interesting, would you mind giving this video a thumbs up? I think this is fascinating because I think most players are nowhere similar to this when it comes to their overall 4-betting strategy when they open the cutoff, face a re-steal from the big blind, and here they are. I think most players are going to be 4-betting queens plus as a pure default. I think ace king is going to be a pure 4-bet for most players. Even jacks, 10s, ace queen are probably going to get 4-bet a good chunk of the time. I think a lot of players just simply are not going to look like this, but the solver is in solver land. They're assuming perfect GTO 3-betting frequencies from the big blind, perfect GTO responses at every single point going forward throughout a hand, and as such I'm not shocked to see such a strong presence on that overall range protection, especially looking at the call versus 3-bet as opposed to the raw 4-bet percentage. So if you find it interesting, give the video a thumbs up. I'd really be interested to see how many people are finding this one a little bit special. Alright, so I want to go through one more situation with you, and this one's going to be a little bit different because it's a squeeze situation. So we're going to open raise from the hijack, the button is going to call, and the big blind is going to squeeze. Now let's see what the solver suggestion looks like. Alright, so resetting up the situation, we open from the hijack, the button calls, and the big blind squeezes, and here we are on the hijack deciding what we want to do. And let's look first and foremost at the overall frequency, and we notice that the solver is folding this a good chunk of the time. This is one that's starting to look a little bit, quote, more normal, or at least in terms of what do default players in live cash games tend to do. They tend to fold a decent chunk of the time in this spot, and you're noticing a fold of roughly 77% and a 4-betting range of roughly 16%. And just for the record to clarify, that's 16% of the original range, meaning the range the hijack originally decided to open raise with. It's 16% of those hands that are going to be getting 4-bet. It's not 16% of all possible starting hands. And because there are so many extra hands getting folded in this situation, it's not shocking to see that the overall 4-bet construction is pretty darn tight. Yes, you have pure kings, you have pure ace king suited, you have most of the ace king off, most of the pocket queens, there's some aces, some pocket jacks, a little bit of pocket sixes kind of being used as that lightness, but shy of that, you're looking at a pretty darn tight 4-betting range in this situation. And when you look at a lot of responses with the 4-bet versus the squeeze, they do tend to be a little bit tighter overall, overall because the shared continuance responsibility is split between the hijack and the button in this situation, not just responsible for the hijack itself. And if we flick on the calls real quick, we'll notice the other hands that are being continued in this situation, not very many of them, roughly half the amount of hands that are getting 4-bet overall. So you're getting like pure ace queen suited, the rest of the pocket aces, the rest of the pocket queens, and actually jacks, weirdly enough, is mixed between the 4-bet, the call versus squeeze, and also folding some small chunk of the time. There's a little bit of calling frequency with things like pocket nines, pocket eights, a little bit of pocket tens as well, but a decent chunk of hands are either going to get 4-bet, and of course the larger chunk of them are going to get folded. And you notice, as usual, the solver is thinking about that range protection, which is why you have things like pocket aces not getting 4-bet here 100% of the time, and instead a small fraction of them are being kind of held back in order to protect the call versus squeeze range, as opposed to just always chunking them directly into the 4-betting range overall here. And I'm not going to go hardcore into the follow-up ranges in this hand, but just for the record, if the hijack did decide to call versus the squeeze here, the button would have an option to 4-bet as well. So not that that's the most important thing in the world, just something to keep in mind if you're curious about the overall game tree and parameters in this preflop solve. So those are 4 interesting live cash game GTO 4-betting ranges that I wanted to share with you. Hopefully you enjoyed these and learned something. And again, you don't want to over extrapolate, but it's important to look at some of those micro elements, especially things like the overall continuance frequency, thinking about a heads up situation versus a multi-way situation like that last spot with the squeeze, and thinking about how those overall 4-betting numbers compare to the folding frequency when you're looking at the solver output. And just for the record, there are tons of other 4-betting GTO ranges in the app overall, so definitely make sure to unlock it and start exploring. Keep in mind, this is not a tool you use in real time. You're not pulling up the app while you're playing. This is a study tool only. Please, please, please do not use it while playing, not while playing live, and not while playing online either. Just use it as a study tool. But if you're interested in getting the entire app, you can do so today. Just go to redchippoker.com/app or look for the GTO Poker Ranges app in your Apple or Android store. Download it, give it a spin. All of the open raising ranges are free, both the exploitative and the GTO ones, or you can unlock it and get everything, including the 4-bet ranges we talked about today, and every single other GTO range as well. As always, thank you so much for hanging out today. If you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.